When it comes to gaming, everything can be seen as a risk. And when you have a successful franchise, you're basically working against the clock. Release the game too soon, and you don't give the previous one enough time to breathe. Wait too long, and the industry can move on without you. Technology changes, trends change, and something that once looked revolutionary can suddenly start looking dated. The sequel to Street Fighter 2 wouldn't drop for 6 years. Now, today, 6 years between major sequels probably doesn't sound crazy, but you gotta remember, we're talking about the 90s. Games could receive sequels within a year or two. Hardware generations moved incredibly fast, and the technology developers were using was consistently evolving. And by the time the next numbered entry would come, 3D had already arrived, and Capcom would take an enormous risk. Instead of fully embracing 3D, they would double down on 2D, making this game a product of its time. Welcome to episode 9 of the Street Fighter Takeover. Today, we're going back to 1997 to find out exactly what happened with Street Fighter 3.
Let's get going.
Disgrace to your art.
Shoryuken!
You ready for this?
Face the might twice. Worthless.
Imagine this, no gun, no knife. This is what I want, son.
Now, if you're a returning viewer, I want to start by saying welcome back. We're officially over 100 retrospectives. This is retrospective 101. So let's see what happens another 99 retrospectives from today. Now, to those of you that are new to the channel, allow me to introduce myself. I am the Retro Phantom, and right now we are halfway through the Street Fighter Takeover with about 8 videos left before this journey comes to an end. So if you enjoyed the video or learned something new today, dropping a like helps the channel tremendously in the YouTube algorithm, and it helps get this video in front of more people. Y'all did a great job on the last video, and thank you to everyone. And if you want to be here for the rest of the Street Fighter Takeover, hitting that subscribe button will make sure that you're there for whatever video comes next in the Street Fighter pipeline. We're also getting closer to the 10,000 subscriber mark. Right now, we are less than 300 away, and I would love for you to be there when we cross that milestone. And lastly, if you're feeling generous and you want to support the channel, you can always buy me a cup of coffee. The link is in the description. With that said, let's dive into this. Now, if this is not your first Street Fighter video and you're updated on the story so far, feel free to skip past this recap. I'll give you a moment to do that now. So let's go back to the beginning. In 1987, Capcom released the original Street Fighter. It introduced us to Ryu and Ken, established concepts that would eventually become staples of the series, and gave Capcom the foundation for something much bigger. But the first Street Fighter wasn't the phenomenon that would define the franchise. That wouldn't happen until Street Fighter 2. And even getting there came with a major change. Takashi Nishiyama, the director of the original Street Fighter, would leave Capcom and eventually join SNK. And Nishiyama wasn't the only person to leave. Hiroshi Matsumoto, who also worked on the original Street Fighter, followed him. Over time, former Capcom developers would become part of the talent helping SNK build its own fighting games. Just take a moment to think about that. Some of the people who helped establish Street Fighter would eventually be working for the competition. But Capcom would essentially continue without them. And in '91, everything changed. Street Fighter 2, The World Warrior, had arrived. This was the game that transformed Street Fighter forever. It gave you 8 playable World Warriors, 8 distinct fighting styles, special moves, and most importantly for the time, competitive multiplayer. Combos weren't even originally intended to become one of the defining mechanics of the genre, yet, because of this game, it became one of the defining mechanics of the genre. Street Fighter 2 didn't just become successful, it became a phenomenon. And when something becomes that successful, you don't just walk away from it. So Capcom didn't. Essentially, we got Street Fighter 2 Champion Edition. Then we got Street Fighter 2 Turbo Hyper Fighting. Then we got Super Street Fighter 2. Then we got Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. This game was constantly being updated, expanded, ported, and re-released. But while Capcom was capitalizing on Street Fighter 2, something else was happening. The fighting game genre was exploding. And instead of immediately moving on to Street Fighter 3, Capcom continued expanding the Street Fighter name. We got Street Fighter Alpha Warrior's Dreams, taking the series in a new visual direction while exploring events between the original Street Fighter and Street Fighter 2. Then came Street Fighter Alpha 2, expanding the roster, mechanics, and story even further. Then Capcom started crossing Street Fighter over with other properties. We would get X-Men vs. Street Fighter, which brought Marvel Mutants into the fighting arena and helped establish the crossover formula that Capcom would eventually become famous for. And then, as we covered in the last episode, Street Fighter finally entered the third dimension. But it wasn't Capcom necessarily making this game, but they were the publishers of it. Akira Nishitani, one of the major figures behind Street Fighter 2, had also left Capcom and founded his own company called Arika. Arika would partner with Capcom to create Street Fighter EX, taking Street Fighter's traditional 2D gameplay and combining it with 3D polygonal graphics. So by this point, let's look at what's happened. The director of the original Street Fighter had left. Other developers followed him. One of the major minds behind Street Fighter 2 had left. Former Capcom talent was now working elsewhere in the industry. SNK had become a major fighting game competitor. 3D fighting games were becoming increasingly important, and Street Fighter itself was being pulled in multiple directions. Street Fighter 2 was still receiving attention. Alpha became his own series. Street Fighter even made it to the big screen. It was crossing over with Marvel, and Arika had taken it into 3D. And behind all of this, Capcom was still trying to figure out where Street Fighter was supposed to go next, because that's the chaotic history. Street Fighter wasn't gone, far from it. Between 91 and 97, it felt like the name Street Fighter was everywhere. It was in the arcades. It started making its presence in the homes. It made it to the big screen. It even had an anime inspired by it. Capcom has spent years expanding Street Fighter in almost every direction imaginable. But there was one thing missing. One game that should have represented the next generation of the franchise. The game that should have answered the questions of what came after Street Fighter 2. Because out of all these games, none of them was Street Fighter 3. And that brings us to today.
Street Fighter 3.
The worst thing you can do when you have an audience waiting for something is say completely nothing. And understand, between the releases of Street Fighter 2 and Street Fighter 3, people had years to speculate about what the next number entry would actually look like. Street Fighter had made a name for itself using 2D animation, but the industry around it was beginning to move forward towards 3D graphics and 3D fighting games. So naturally, people started assuming what Street Fighter would look like when Capcom finally decided to make that jump. Magazines reported all kinds of rumors. There was speculation that characters would now have 5 special moves instead of the 3 people were accustomed to at the time. There were claims that charge moves would disappear entirely. And of course, there was the biggest rumor of them all. Street Fighter 3 was going to be 3D. And my personal favorite was the idea that this game would eventually make its appearance on the N64. I wonder how that rumor aged. Of course, with the benefit of hindsight, we know that a lot of these rumors were exactly that, rumors. Because by the end of this section, you're going to see what was actually happening inside of Capcom. And somehow, the truth is even more interesting. The first thing we need to understand is what was happening to gaming itself. By the middle of the 90s, two consoles were making their presence known in people's homes: the Sony PlayStation and the Sega Saturn. And home consoles like these were changing the relationship between arcade games and the home market. More importantly, for Street Fighter, both platforms became associated with fighting games that represented where the genre appeared to be heading. Sega had Virtua Fighter, the game credited with bringing polygonal 3D graphics to the fighting genre. And then you had Tekken, which would become one of PlayStation's marquee fighting franchises. Games like these made 3D feel new. They felt modern. And for a lot of people at the time, they made traditional 2D games look like something the industry was getting ready to leave in the dust. That's important to understand. Looking back today, we can appreciate beautiful sprite work, regardless of whether a game is 2D or 3D. But during this period, simply seeing a character rendered with polygons can make something feel like the future. Even Akira Yasuda recognized the position Capcom was in. He would go on to say, Virtua Fighter had already come out by that point, right? I mean, there was no way 2D graphics could win against that. If we were going to beat Virtua Fighter, we had to make something that would go down in the annals of gaming history. I knew it was a battle we weren't going to win, but we had to fight it anyway. And I think that quote perfectly explains the mentality surrounding this game, because the question wasn't simply, how do we make another Street Fighter? It was, how far can Capcom push Street Fighter while refusing to abandon what Street Fighter fundamentally was? Despite what the rumors were saying, Capcom wasn't preparing to turn Street Fighter 3 into a traditional 3D fighting game. They were going to stay with 2D, but they weren't trying to make Street Fighter 2 again either. If they were going to remain 2D while the rest of the industry was becoming fascinated with polygons, they needed to create a 2D game capable of making people stop and pay attention. And that decision made Street Fighter 3 a risk. Capcom was essentially betting that it could push 2D far enough that the technology itself wouldn't matter. But here's where the story starts to get weird, because the game that would eventually become Street Fighter 3 wasn't originally Street Fighter 3 at all. Now, while this is a Street Fighter series, we've seen Capcom do this before. I haven't covered enough on this company, but I do know their history and know that Capcom has a habit of starting with one idea and somehow ending up with something completely different. Like, I have seen versions of that story with Sweet Home becoming Resident Evil becoming Devil May Cry. You look at Final Fight, what originally started out as Street Fighter 2. And we will see this trend continue with the development of Street Fighter 3. Enter Tamayoshi Sadamoto. Sadamoto was producing a new fighting game at Capcom that originally had absolutely zero to do with Street Fighter. The project was known as New Generation, and the goal wasn't originally to create the success of Street Fighter 2. Instead, this project was supposed to help represent the next generation of Capcom's arcade technology through the company's new CPS3 hardware. Capcom wanted to push its artwork animation much further than it had before, but there was already a problem: resources. At the beginning of development, the team was relatively small because Capcom was simultaneously working on Darkstalkers. Takayuki Nakayama would later explain, this project utilized a new CPS3 board, which increased the number of colors that could be used for the characters from 16 to 64. Also, extra production effort was required to make the character animations more detailed. On top of that, the production of Darkstalkers was running simultaneously, making the initial team size small at the start of the project. So from the beginning, New Generation was ambitious. New hardware, more colors, more detailed animation, and a small development team. But despite all that technology behind it, the project had another problem. It didn't have an identity. The game was struggling to find its face. And this is where Akira Yasuda makes a proposal that would completely change the trajectory of the project. If Capcom was already making a new fighting game, why not make it Street Fighter? Yasuda would explain, I remember seeing the initial concept of Sadamoto's game and thinking, they're probably going to want to turn this into a Street Fighter game anyway. The characters didn't seem to have a lot of personality, so I proposed that they add Ryu and turn the game into a Street Fighter game. At the time, there were team members who weren't really open to or supportive of that idea. And understand what that means. Ryu wasn't even supposed to be here. The character most synonymous with Street Fighter was being added to a game that hadn't even been designed as Street Fighter. Capcom ultimately went forward with the idea, and suddenly this experimental fighting game designed to showcase new hardware inherited something much bigger: the responsibility of becoming the successor to Street Fighter 2. And as you can see, not everyone was happy about it.
最初に龍もいなかったしチュニーもいなかったわけで、で多分当時のスタッフたちはだから新しい人を作るんだからストリートファイター作るんだからいらないって新しい主人公を作るんだって言ってたと僕は思うんですけど、確かアレックスですね、
主人公も変えてきたっていうですよね。
で多分2年くらい経った時にストリートファイターなら龍がいなきゃダメだろうって岡本さんに言われて
それはですね、
いやそれはみんな周りから見ててもそう見えてたんですよ。それは龍がいないときっとストリートファイターになんないんだよって思ってたけど、まあチームはそうやって頑張ってたじゃないですか。だからちょっとこう見守ってたんですよね。で聞かれたらみんな言うようには思ってたんですけど。
So now the game had a direction. It's Street Fighter. Ryu was here. Surely Capcom could bring back the experienced developers who had spent years making these games and have them guide this new team towards the finish line, right?
実際ずっとなんだろう、もうそのスパツ X の思いがあったんで関わらないと決めてたので、そこはね、プレッシャーとみんなの俺ストリートファイター感がぶつかってたからじゃないんですかね。かかるまで本当にそれがかかったと思います。グラフィックの方向性が特にそうだったんじゃないですかね。だからその新しい基盤になって色数もたくさん使えるようになったし、でなおかつ制約も増えたんですね。
Well, this is where things start to get a little chaotic. Noritaku Funimizu, who had been one of the prominent figures behind Street Fighter 2 development, was stepping down. By this point, the man was tired. And honestly, can you blame him? Look at how much Street Fighter content Capcom had produced in Street Fighter 2. Funimizu had developed serious Street Fighter fatigue. When Capcom expected him to move on to Street Fighter 3, he wanted zero parts of it. He explained, Street Fighter 3 was a point when I said I would no longer do this. I think I just been so involved with the Street Fighter series that Capcom initially assumed, yeah, you've got to make 3 as well. I said no. At that point, I just wanted to make my own game. So one of the people you would naturally expect to help Street Fighter 3 said no, and Funimizu wasn't the only issue. Remember what else Capcom was doing at this time? Darkstalkers was in development. The Street Fighter Alpha series was being developed. Capcom was producing multiple fighting games at the same time. So the company's experienced fighting game developers were being spread thin across different projects. In Street Fighter 3, the game that was supposed to follow one of the most influential fighting games ever made was being developed largely by people with little to zero experience actually making fighting games. This is where the project really starts running into trouble, because you can have incredible artists, you can have powerful hardware, you can even create beautiful animation, but somebody still has to answer one fundamental question. Is the game actually fun to play? And after roughly 2 to 3 years of development, Street Fighter 3 still hadn't completely answered that question. That's when Shinichiro Obata entered the picture. Obata was coming off his work on 1920 and looking for his next project. Eventually, all roads led to Street Fighter 3. And what he found when he arrived says a lot about the condition the game was actually in. As Obata would explain, So by the time I came around, the team didn't really have a clear concept of what to do with the game. They had created a lot of animation patterns. They wanted the hits to feel like they had a real heft behind them to make it look cool when you took damage. But the problem was the team had no idea what kind of mechanics should go into the game in order to make it an interesting fighting game. There was no plan for that, and there weren't enough moves for each character. So I ended up joining the team when the game was in that kind of state. And that was a kind of state of Street Fighter 3. They had the animation, they had the hardware, they had the Street Fighter name, they even had Ryu. But after years of development, they were still trying to figure out the game. Obata would help stabilize the project. But getting Street Fighter 3 under control was going to require much more than simply adding a few moves, because Capcom still had to figure out the mechanics, the characters, the technology, and ultimately what was going to make this game worthy of the number 3. But Obata stepping in didn't magically solve everything overnight. Another major problem was the technology itself. Street Fighter 3 was being developed for Capcom's brand new CPS-3 hardware, and while that hardware gave the team much room to work with, Capcom didn't yet have all the tools needed to take full advantage of it. Akira Yasuda would later explain that the team had to make decisions about whether they wanted higher resolution or more colors on the screen, ultimately choosing to focus on the larger color palette. So while CPS-3 was supposed to represent the future of Capcom's 2D arcade games, the team was essentially learning how to work with that future while building one of the company's most important games at that time. And because so much of Street Fighter 3's animation was being drawn by hand, even relatively small changes could require a lot of additional work. Behind the scenes, the team also lacked the kind of unified structure Capcom's previous fighting games had benefited from. Obata explained that the different developers were responsible for balancing different characters, which meant one person might approach the character like a traditional Street Fighter fighter, while another might design theirs more like something out of Darkstalkers. There wasn't one consistent vision tying everything together, and this was very different from earlier Capcom fighting games, where much of the balancing had been handled by a smaller group of experienced developers. So Street Fighter 3 wasn't just dealing with inexperienced staff, it was dealing with a development process that itself was trying to find some kind of consistency. Things would eventually begin moving in a better direction when more experienced developers joined the team. Programmer Kazuhiro Nakai helped speed up production and gave Obata someone who could actually turn many of his ideas into working systems. Then, only around 5 or 6 months before development was completed, Neo G joined the project after working on Street Fighter Alpha 2 and helped bring even more stability to the team. By that point, Street Fighter 3 was finally beginning to resemble something Capcom could actually release. But Obata would later admit that the biggest problem throughout the development was indecision. The team had spent years going back and forth trying to figure out what this game was supposed to be while carrying the pressure of one of the most important fighting games ever made. And that's exactly what makes its development so fascinating. Street Fighter 3 wasn't being created by some perfectly organized dream team that knew exactly where the series needed to go. It started as another game entirely, inherited the Street Fighter name halfway through its identity crisis, lost access to many of the veterans you would expect to be leading it. It was being developed on unfamiliar hardware and had a team still trying to find a unified direction years into production. But somehow, some way, they were finally getting there. The technology was finally coming together. The team eventually was coming together. The game was finally starting to take shape. And on February 28th, 1997, the world was finally given Street Fighter 3. So understand, there are essentially 3 different versions of Street Fighter 3, and I'm going to talk about all 3 for this retrospective. We have Street Fighter 3 New Generation, Street Fighter 3 Second Impact, and finally, the game that most people probably think about whenever Street Fighter 3 is mentioned today, Street Fighter 3 Third Strike. And just like I did when we covered the different versions of Street Fighter 2, we're going to take these one at a time and see how the game changed and evolved with each iteration. So naturally, we got to start at the beginning. Street Fighter 3 New Generation. And unlike practically every other Street Fighter we covered so far, New Generation gives us an interesting problem. Because if you wanted to play this game in 97, you were going to the arcade. New Generation didn't receive its own contemporary home console port until Double Impact came out, which also contained Second Impact on the same disc. So there's no PlayStation version waiting for you, no Sega Saturn version waiting for you, and definitely no N64 version like some of those old rumors had claimed. But it would eventually make its way to the Dreamcast. But let's continue. New Generation was the first release game built around Capcom's new arcade hardware, and the setup was considerably more complicated than simply putting a cartridge into a machine. The CPS3 setup used a motherboard with SIMM memory, a CD-ROM, and security cartridge. Game data from the CD had to be installed onto the system's memory, meaning setting up the game could involve a lengthy initialization process. And then there was Capcom Security. The CPS security cartridge used battery-backed technology as part of its protection system, creating what collectors would eventually refer to as the infamous suicide battery. If that system failed, you could potentially end up with some very expensive arcade hardware that no longer booted properly, which makes sense as a lesson that they learned during the Street Fighter II era with Rainbow Edition. So before we talk about actually playing Street Fighter 3, this was a very different beast from the hardware that powered Street Fighter 2. But once you actually stood in front of the machine, everything became immediately familiar. Joystick, 6 buttons, 3 punches, 3 kicks, 2 players. At its core, Street Fighter was still Street Fighter. But once you started moving, that's when you notice things have changed. Street Fighter 3 greatly expands on what you can do with your character before you even start talking about special moves. Characters can dash forward or quickly retreat backwards, making movement considerably more explosive than simply walking back and forth across the screen. You also have access to super jumps, allowing characters to cover considerably more vertical and horizontal space. Then there are leap attacks. These are short universal hopping attacks that can be used to come down on crouching opponents without committing to a traditional full jump. And if somebody knocks you down, you aren't necessarily forced to stay there anymore. Street Fighter 3 includes quick standing, allowing you to recover rapidly after certain knockdowns and get yourself back into the fight. So Capcom was already making ideas it had experimented with throughout games like Darkstalkers and its Marvel Fighters and incorporating them into the foundation of New Generation. But none of these mechanics will become as synonymous to the game with the next one, which is parrying. Traditionally, if somebody attacks you in Street Fighter, you just want to defend yourself. What do? You hold back. Street Fighter 3 basically looks at that instinct and says, what if you did the exact opposite? Right before a standing or mid-level attack connects, you can tap forward. For a low attack, you tap down. Time it correctly, and instead of blocking the attack, you parry it. And there's a massive difference. Blocking can leave you in block stun, and certain special attacks can still chip damage away. A successful parry avoids that. No normal damage, no chip damage, and significantly less interruption to your ability to respond. But there's a catch. You have to time it properly. You can't just sit there holding forward because, well, you're going to eventually get punched in the face a few times. And because you can parry more than just normal attacks, the system fundamentally changes how you look at situations that would traditionally force you onto the defensive. A fireball doesn't necessarily have to be blocked. A special move doesn't have to necessarily be blocked. Even a super art, which we will get to soon, can potentially be parried if you have the timing and confidence to pull it off. Now, the other thing I want to talk about, like I said I was going to speak on, was super arts. We've already seen super combos throughout this takeover, so the idea of building a meter and unleashing a powerful attack isn't anything new. What's different is how Street Fighter 3 handles your selection. After choosing your character, you choose one of the available super arts before the fight, and you're locked into that selection. This isn't just choosing which cool animation you want to see either. Your special art determines characteristics of your super meter, including its length and how many stocks you can potentially hold. So you're making a decision before the match even starts. Do you want to access something more frequently? Do you want a particular attack because of what allows your character to do? Or do you choose something requiring more meter because you think the payoff is worth it? New Generation allows certain moves to be canceled into super arts, giving the player another way to connect their offense into these attacks. And again, knowing what we know now about this game's development, you can actually see some of the ideas Obata and the rest of that struggling team were trying to put together finally working on the screen. Now, not everything was modernized though. The rules still use the more traditional Street Fighter input philosophy, using directional inputs alongside particular punch or kick buttons when you're close to an opponent. So if you're coming into New Generation from a modern Street Fighter game, don't expect the universal light punch light kick throw command associated with later entries. This is still a game sitting somewhere between old Street Fighter and what the series would eventually become. And honestly, that's a good way of describing New Generation as a whole. You can still see Street Fighter beneath it. Heck, you can even see ideas from Darkstalkers in it. You can see ideas Capcom had experimented with through its Marvel games. And then you have an entirely new concept, parrying and selectable super arts sitting on top of everything. It's Street Fighter trying to figure out what Street Fighter should be in 97. Now, when it comes to actually playing through the game, New Generation keeps things relatively straightforward. Your arcade consists of 7 fights. The first 6 put you against other members of the roster before eventually bringing you face to face with the game's final boss, Gil. And that's it. There isn't a hidden Akuma waiting to jump you because you got a bunch of perfects. There isn't some secret mini boss buried inside the ladder because you had super finishes. Gil is the final obstacle. Yin and Yang are a little unusual in how their arcade progression is structured, but generally speaking, you're fighting your way through the roster until reaching Gil. And speaking of that roster, let's talk about it. Returning from the previous games are Ryu and Ken. That's it. Everybody else represents Capcom's attempt to create the next generation of Street Fighter. We have Alex, who Capcom positioned as the new protagonist, Dudley, Elena, Ibuki, Necro, Oro, Sean, and the brothers Yun and Yang, who share a character select position in New Generation, but are distinct fighters. And finally, we have Gil, the game's final boss. So this isn't Street Fighter 2 with some new people sprinkled in the roster. This is Street Fighter 3's New Generation. So let's talk about these characters, starting with Alex. He's the man Capcom was building up to be the new face of Street Fighter. Alex is the primary protagonist in New Generation, a young American fighter from Manhattan, New York, who was raised by his father's friend Tom after losing his parents. And when you look at Alex, his inspiration comes heavily from professional wrestling. Akiman designed him with Hulk Hogan as a major influence, which you can see through his massive physique, blonde hair, headband, and wrestling-based offense. But there's some Japanese influence mixed in there as well. His red shoulder markings and the paint underneath his eyes were influenced by Akira Fudo from Devilman, while Alex's facial appearance was also influenced by actor Christopher Lambert, whom Capcom artist Kinu Nishimura was reportedly a fan of. So when Capcom was essentially combining American professional wrestling, anime, and Hollywood influences to create the character they hoped could carry Street Fighter into a new generation. Alex's story begins when Tom is badly injured after fighting Gil. Alex wants revenge and decides to track Gil down, despite Tom telling him that he doesn't need to avenge him. Alex eventually finds and defeats Gil, but by the time he returns home, something has changed. Tom realizes too, Alex's journey stopped being solely about revenge. Fighting Gil and traveling the world exposed Alex to powerful fighters outside of everything he had previously known, and now he wants to see just how far his own strength can take him. Tom ultimately gives Alex his blessing to leave and find his own path, transforming his original revenge mission into the beginning of Alex's journey as a fighter, which is fitting for someone Capcom was positioning as a protagonist of a new generation. Next up is Ryu, and honestly, at this point in the Street Fighter Takeover, this man needs no introduction. What's important here is that despite Capcom building Street Fighter 3 around a new generation of fighters, Ryu was one of the only veterans they couldn't completely leave behind. By this point in his life, Ryu was still doing what Ryu does. Traveling, training, and searching for stronger opponents. There's no revenge mission, no tournament he desperately needs to win, and no guild-related personal conflict driving him. Fighting itself is the journey. His ending reinforces that perfectly after everything is over. Ryu is hitchhiking towards Oakland, already thinking about where he's going next. He tells Ken that he'll continue fighting and training and searching before essentially calling out to the warriors of the world to wait for him. Alex may be the new protagonist, but Ryu will always be Ryu. And naturally, if Ryu survived Capcom's roster purge, Ken wasn't going to be too far behind. By New Generation, Ken is still at a very different point in his life from his lifelong rival. He's now a family man with Eliza and their son Mel, but that hasn't stopped him from fighting. In his ending, Ken is training when Eliza and Mel arrive, and apparently Ken got a little too carried away because Mel accidentally gets caught in one of his attacks. After Eliza understandably loses her mind, Ken takes the hit himself and gets knocked flat. It's a comedic ending, but it also highlights the difference between these two characters at this stage of their lives. Ryu finishes New Generation, immediately heading towards his next challenge, while Ken has already built an entire life waiting for him outside of fighting. Next, we have Sean, a 17-year-old Brazilian fighter who represents something completely different for Street Fighter 3, the inexperienced student. Sean idolizes Ken and wants Ken to train him, which explains why his fighting style resembles the traditional Ryu and Ken formula, while intentionally feeling rougher and less refined. His design also fits Street Fighter 3's younger, more urban identity, with his bright yellow gi, energetic personality, and recurring basketball motif helping separate him visually from the fighters he looks up to. Rather than introducing another martial arts master, Capcom gives us an overconfident kid who still has a lot to learn, and Sean believes Ken is a person who can teach them. In a way, he kind of mirrors Sakura from the Alpha series on how she felt about Ryu, but this time it's Sean. His New Generation ending makes that relationship official, but not before showing just how far Sean still has to go. After his journey, Sean challenges Ryu and gets absolutely destroyed. Ken tells him that if he seriously wants to become the best, he needs to defeat Ryu, and he shouldn't come back until he does. Sean then encounters Ryu again, only to get dropped once more. When Ryu realizes Sean is fighting him because Ken told him to, Ryu basically tells him to stop complaining and fight. Sean gets back up and tries again, establishing him as Street Fighter 3's underdog. He's nowhere near Ryu or Ken's level yet, but the kid certainly isn't going to stop trying. Next, we have Ibuki, a teenage prodigy raised in an ancient shinobi village. And despite being trained basically her entire life to become a deadly kunoichi, she really just wants to be a normal teenage girl. That contrast is the entire charm of her character. She can throw kunai, move at a ridiculous speed, and perform highly trained ninja techniques, but she rather experienced school, boys, than an ordinary life outside the village. Her design was also connected to Lin Kurawasa from Capcom's Alien vs. Predator, particularly elements of her appearance and fast-moving fighting style, while Buki continues Street Fighter's history of ninja characters dating back to Geki in the original Street Fighter. But instead of making her the stereotypical mysterious ninja, Capcom gave her the personality of a teenager who happens to have been born in this ridiculous lifestyle. And unfortunately for Ibuki, her new generation story proves that leaving that lifestyle isn't going to be easy. She's sent after Gil to obtain something called the G file, and after defeating him, Gil actually honors his words and gives it to her, claiming the project connected to it has already begun and cannot be stopped. Ibuki returns with what should be an incredibly important document, only for her normal teenage life to immediately come crashing back into the picture. While relaxing outside, she senses someone approaching and attacks on instinct, only to discover it's her friend, whose bag and textbooks Ibuki completely destroys in the process. So after fighting Gil and obtaining this mysterious G file, Ibuki's ending ultimately comes back to what defines her character. She may desperately want to live like an ordinary schoolgirl, but when you spend your entire life being trained as a ninja, apparently it's pretty hard to turn that off. Next, we have Elena, a princess from Kenya and the daughter of Jafari, the leader of her tribe. Unlike many of the fighters we uncovered, Elena isn't traveling because of revenge or some desperate need to prove herself. She genuinely loves meeting people, experiencing different cultures, and making friends around the world. Her tall, lean design draws inspiration from East African culture, while her fighting style uses capoeira, making her especially unique because she fights almost entirely with her legs. Even her personality complements the rhythmic nature of her fighting style. Elena is cheerful, loves music and nature, and is described as being able to listen to the voices of the wind and trees. Her father also studied abroad and earned a medical degree in France, giving Elena an upbringing that combines her Kenyan heritage with an interest in experiencing the world beyond her home. And her new generation ending perfectly captures that side of her character. Rather than ending with some massive rivalry or another quest for strength, Elena writes home to her parents after traveling the world and tells them that she finally found another place she can call home. She's studying abroad in Japan, where she becomes close friends with a girl named Narumi. And Elena embraces the idea her father taught her that friendship is universal. We then see her riding through Japan with Narumi before Elena talks about bringing all of her new friends back home during summer vacation. It's a simple ending, but that's really Elena in a nutshell. In a game filled with people fighting for revenge, power, and secret organizations, Elena is traveling the world, kicking everybody's behind, and somehow making friends along the way. Next, we have Dudley, Street Fighter III's gentleman boxer from England. Dudley is basically the complete opposite of the stereotypical rough and tough boxer we've seen in the past. He's sophisticated, polite, dresses like an English gentleman, loves roses, and expects his opponent to fight with class. Even while beating the hell out of somebody, Dudley wants to maintain proper etiquette. His character has often been compared to British boxing champion Chris Eubank, particularly through his flamboyant, gentlemanly presentation and refined personality. And while Balrog already represented boxing in Street Fighter, Dudley allowed Capcom to completely reinterpret the fighting style for this new generation, focusing on technique, speed, and combinations while wrapping everything inside this exaggerated British aristocratic personality. Dudley's new generation story isn't about becoming the world's greatest boxer. This man just wants his dad's car back. Dudley's father was once a successful businessman before eventually losing everything, including a prized automobile that Dudley deeply remembers from his childhood. After defeating Gil, Dudley demands the car's return, and Gil actually keeps his word and orders Colin to give him the keys. Dudley finally gets behind the wheel of his father's restored car and immediately falls in love with the sound of the engine and steering, calling it perfect, right before another vehicle apparently bumps into him. But in the end, Dudley accomplished exactly what he came for. Forget world domination, ancient conspiracies, or becoming the strongest fighter alive. The gentleman got his car back. Next, we have Yun and Yang, twin brothers from Hong Kong, and interestingly enough, the nephews of Lee from the original Street Fighter, giving these two newcomers a direct connection all the way back to where this takeover started. Both practice Chinese martial arts and protect their local community, but their personalities couldn't be more different. Young is the energetic, cocky older brother, while Yang is the quieter and more composed younger twin. Their designs embrace Street Fighter III's 90s style, with Young rocking his baseball cap and skateboard, while Yang has a much more reserved appearance. Their visual designs have been associated with Duo Maxwell and Control Barton for Mobile Suit Gundam Wing, while elements of their martial arts were influenced by the manga Kenji. But in New Generation, the distinction between the brothers was mostly cosmetic. Yang essentially functioned as an alternate version of Yun, sharing his moveset before Capcom would finally separate the two and give Yang his own fighting identity in Second Impact. And because they're essentially treated as a pair here, Yun and Yang share the same New Generation ending. After completing their journey, the Lee brothers return home, where people in the neighborhood are excited to see them again. When they're asked whether their kung fu was good enough to survive in the real world, naturally these two decide the best way to answer is to start showing off right there in the middle of the market and nearly destroy a man's stand in the process. But their conclusion is simple. After traveling and testing themselves against fighters from around the world, Yun and Yang confidently declare that their kung fu is the world's strongest. It's a lighthearted ending, but it establishes what these two are about. Young martial artists with plenty of confidence, plenty of talent, and absolutely no problem proving it together. Next, we have Necro, and he's easily one of the strangest additions in Street Fighter III's roster. Originally a normal young man from Russia, Necro was captured by Gil's secret society and subjected to genetic experimentation, transforming his body and giving him the ability to stretch his limbs and generate electricity. And if those abilities sound familiar, that's because Necro essentially combines characteristics of two classic Street Fighter characters, Dasim's long-range stretching attacks with Blanca's electricity, while still having a fighting style and movement completely of his own. His bizarre appearance also fits the science fiction horror surrounding his origin, but underneath all of that is a pretty tragic character. Necro never asked for these abilities, and his entire motivation is simply escaping the people who turned him into this fighter. The one person standing beside him, Effie, his girlfriend and companion, whose design was reportedly inspired by Aki Man's girlfriend at the time. And Necro's New Generation ending shows exactly how disposable Gil's organization considers him. After defeating Gil, Necro discovers that the entire situation was essentially a trap. Gil seals him inside the facility and tells him the experiment is over and he is expendable before activating the facility's self-destruct sequence. But just when Necro appears completely screwed, Effie arrives and breaks him free. The two escape on a motorcycle moments before the entire facility explodes behind them, and Necro wonders what will happen to them now. Effie's answer perfectly sums up their story. She doesn't know, but that's part of being free. Anything is possible. For someone whose body and life were taken away from him, Necro's ending isn't really about winning a tournament. It's about finally taking his life back. Next, we have Oro, and this dude might look like a frail old man, but he's actually one of the most powerful fighters introduced in Street Fighter 3. Oro is a 140-year-old Japanese hermit living in Brazil who has mastered the mystical art of Senjutsu. And he's become so powerful that he intentionally fights with one arm restrained to keep himself from seriously hurting his opponents. He feels that classic martial arts archetype of the eccentric old master who looks harmless until you realize he could probably destroy everybody around him. His character draws from the imaginary ancient martial artist hermits and spiritual masters, with comparisons often made to figures such as Bodhidharma, while his one-arm fighting gimmick reinforces the idea that Oro is constantly handicapping himself. And like most of the roster, Oro isn't searching for someone who can teach him anything. He's looking for someone worthy enough for him to teach. That's essentially his entire motivation in New Generation. Oro has spent years searching for a successor capable of inheriting his knowledge, but nobody has impressed him enough to become his student. That changes when he encounters Ryu. Oro recognizes Ryu's genuine passion for fighting and decides that the kid with the headband might finally have the potential he's been looking for. So what does this 140-year-old master do? He gets on a plane and starts chasing Ryu around the world, declaring that he's going to teach him how to fight all over again until Ryu becomes good enough to inherit his techniques. And you see the irony here. We spent this entire series watching Ryu become one of the greatest fighters in the world, and Oro takes one look at him and basically says, "Yep, I can work with this kid." Now that we spoke on new generation, let's see how audiences felt about it. In Japan, Game Machine listed Street Fighter 3 as the most successful arcade game of March of 97. So there was clearly interest in seeing what Capcom had been working on for all these years. And visually, Street Fighter 3 was difficult to ignore. The CPS3 hardware allowed Capcom to create some incredibly detailed sprite work with characters displaying a level of fluidity and animation that previous Street Fighter games simply couldn't achieve. This was exactly what Capcom had spent years trying to accomplish. They didn't want to follow Virtua Fighter and Tekken into 3D. They wanted to prove there was still somewhat a market for 2D fighting games. And from a technical standpoint, Street Fighter 3 made one heck of an argument. But here's the problem. Being technically impressive didn't necessarily mean this was the Street Fighter 3 everyone had been waiting 6 years to play. And some contemporary critics noticed that immediately. Next Generation reviewed the game release and gave Street Fighter 3 4 out of 5 stars. Sure, that's a good score, but what they actually wrote about the game is far more interesting than that number. They stated, "The great mystery is why Capcom called this Street Fighter 3 instead of leaving that honor for a more powerful revolutionary 3D title. Gameplay in the Street Fighter series reached the ceiling of 2D possibilities a while ago, and as good as this game admittedly is, besides the stunning graphics, there's little to distinguish it from the 11 games before." And there you have it. Remember everything we talked about during background information. Akira Yasuda himself acknowledged that Capcom was entering a battle against games like Virtua Fighter that he didn't believe 2D could win. But they fought that battle anyway. Now, the game was finally sitting inside arcades, and you had critics essentially asking, why is this Street Fighter 3? Not because the game looked bad, quite the opposite. The graphics were praised, the gameplay was still good. But after 6 years of waiting and after watching the rest of the industry embrace an entirely new dimension, some players expected the number 3 to mean something revolutionary. And to them, another 2D fighter, regardless of how beautiful that 2D was, didn't necessarily represent the generational leap they expected. GamePro expressed a similar sentiment. They praised the graphics and controls, but criticized the game for lacking the innovation and evolution expected from a true sequel to Street Fighter II. And criticism extended beyond the technology. It extended to the characters. Remember, Capcom had taken another enormous gamble by removing practically the entire recognizable Street Fighter roster. Instead, Ryu and Ken were surrounded by an almost completely new generation of fighters. See what I did there? GamePro felt the results were mixed, even suggesting that some of these new characters seem more appropriate for Darkstalkers than Street Fighter. And that criticism is interesting when you remember what was happening during development. These games were being created in a completely isolated bubbles. Capcom had fighting game talent spread between different projects, and Street Fighter 3 itself had struggled for years to establish exactly what kind of fighting game it wanted to be. And New Generation wasn't perfectly balanced either. This was still the first version of a new fighting game, and players would discover exploits, infinite loops, and balance problems that Capcom would have to address. But perhaps the biggest problem wasn't any individual character or mechanic. It was timing. Street Fighter 3 arrived in 97. The industry that Street Fighter 2 helped reshape in 91 was no longer the same industry. Polygonal graphics were becoming increasingly associated with technological advancements. Home consoles were becoming more capable of providing experiences that once required a trip to the arcade, and Capcom walked directly into that environment with an expensive new arcade board powering one of the most elaborate 2D fighting games ever produced. That's what makes Street Fighter 3 a product of its time, because today we could look at this animation and appreciate how incredible it is. But in 97, some people weren't asking how beautiful sprites were. They were asking why were we looking at sprites at all? And unfortunately, that disconnect appears to have affected the game's commercial performance. Despite topping Game Machine's Japanese arcade rankings in March of 97, Street Fighter 3 reportedly struggled to recover its enormous development investment. The game's reported budget reached approximately 1 billion yen, or around $8 million US at the time, which is now worth 16 million today. While reports have placed Japanese cabinet sales at only around 1,000 units, with worldwide estimates varying considerably. GamePro's conclusion probably summarizes that strange reception better than anything else. Rather than leaving them excited to repeatedly play Street Fighter, they felt the game made them look forward to whatever Capcom would do with the next one. And fortunately for Capcom, they wouldn't have to wait another 6 years because this was only the first iteration of Street Fighter 3, meaning there was still plenty of room for improvement.
Come on.
So now we move on to the second iteration of Street Fighter 3, and the first of two major updates Capcom will release in an attempt to improve upon new generation. Street Fighter 3 Second Impact, Giant Attack as it's fully known, was released in arcades on September 30th, 1997. And just look at how quickly things happen. New Generation released earlier that same year, and only months later Capcom already had another version of Street Fighter 3 ready to go. Remember where we just left New Generation. Capcom has spent years developing Street Fighter 3. They created new arcade hardware. They pushed 2D animation further than they ever had before. They introduced an almost completely new cast, built new mechanics around them, and after all of that, Street Fighter 3 wasn't performing the way Capcom needed it to. New Generation struggled commercially, which was exceptionally painful considering how much time and money Capcom had invested into creating it. But sales weren't the only problem. There were things the developers wanted to improve, and there were things that players weren't completely satisfied with either. The roster was probably the biggest example. Capcom had taken an enormous gamble by removing almost every recognizable Street Fighter character outside of Ryu and Ken. And while I understand what they were going for, the game was literally called New Generation. That meant people who had spent years playing as Chun-Li, Guile, Zangief, and etc. suddenly didn't have those characters anymore. And on top of that, New Generation didn't exactly have the largest roster to begin with, so Capcom had a decision to make. Do you abandon this whole idea and basically turn Street Fighter 3 back into Street Fighter 2? Or do you build on what you already have? And Capcom would choose the latter. That's the most important thing to understand about Second Impact. This isn't Capcom starting over. It's Capcom refining an idea that wasn't finished yet. The New Generation wasn't going anywhere. Alex was still the protagonist. Dudley, Ibuki, Elena, Sean, Necro, Oro, Yun, they were all staying. The Parry system wasn't going anywhere either, neither with the super arcs, the overall visual identity. Instead, Capcom started looking at what they had already had and started asking, how do we make this better? Where is there room for improvement? More characters? More gameplay options? Better handling? Maybe more single-player content? Add a little bit more polish? And yes, even another familiar face with Street Fighter's past. And that's what makes Second Impact interesting to me. New Generation took the risk. Second Impact dealt with the consequences. And remember, it hadn't even been a full year. Fans spent around 6 years waiting for Capcom to finally count to 3. And within months of Street Fighter 3 finally arriving, Capcom was already trying to make it better. So now that we understand why Second Impact exists, let's see exactly what changed. And right away, don't expect Street Fighter 3 to suddenly become a completely different game. The foundation of New Generation is still here. The whole mechanic system is still here. Instead of rebuilding the house, Capcom started adding rooms to it. And the first place you'll notice that is in the roster. Every fighter from New Generation returns, but we have some new additions. First is Hugo, who technically isn't completely new to the Capcom universe. Hugo was based on the enemies from Final Fight bringing that massive wrestler archetype to Street Fighter as a playable character. Then we have Urine, a direct connection to Gil, and gives us another look into the mysterious organization surrounding Street Fighter 3's story. But arguably, the most important addition wasn't a new character at all, because Capcom brought back somebody players already knew, Akuma. After New Generation gave returning players essentially Ryu and Ken, Akuma's appearance finally added another recognizable Street Fighter veteran to the roster. But he isn't simply handed to you like everyone else. Akuma's a secret character like in the other games. He can be selected by the player, encountered as a hidden CPU opponent, and under the right circumstances, you can even encounter the more powerful Shin Akuma. And then we have Yang. Remember in New Generation, Yun and Yang were essentially two versions of the same character? That changes here. Yang finally receives his own special moves and super arts, beginning the separation between the twins and giving him an actual gameplay identity of its own. So with these changes, the playable roster increased to 14 fighters. Still not massive, but it's already more variety in what New Generation gave us. And the roster wasn't the only thing getting expanded. One of the biggest additions to Second Impact was something that would eventually become the staple of Street Fighter, EX special moves. The idea is pretty simple. Instead of performing the normal version of certain special moves, you can spend a portion of your super art gauge to perform an enhanced version. You perform the same basic command, but instead of pressing one attack button, you would press two of the same type. 2 punches or 2 kicks. And depending on the move, the EX version can give you additional hits, more damage, different properties, or completely new combo opportunities, which means your super art gauge suddenly gained another purpose. In New Generation, you're primarily building that meter towards your super art. Then we have personal attacks. Basically, Street Fighter 3 found a way to make taunting useful. Each character has their own personal attack, and successfully completing one can actually provide a gameplay benefit. Ryu, for example, can reduce his stun gauge. Other characters can receive benefits affecting things like attack or defense. So imagine knocking somebody down, and instead of immediately attacking them again, you start taunting. Except you're not necessarily doing it to piss them off. You're actually getting something out of it. Now there is a risk-reward element. And underneath all of that, Capcom continued tweaking the game itself. Frame data was changed, characters received new moves, some animations were improved, and super art gauges were adjusted. And another important defensive mechanic was added, tech throws. Now, if your opponent attempts to throw you and you react correctly, you can now escape with a throw. Again, none of these changes individually transform Street Fighter into another game, but put them together and you start seeing the philosophy behind Second Impact, refinement. There's even a nice little quality of life change for the arcade multiplayer. If another player jumps into the machine and challenges you, the player already playing is allowed to change their selected super art before the fight. Small change, but useful. And thankfully, the single player side got some attention too. Players now fight 8 opponents leading towards a character-specific final opponent with dialogue before the match. Under certain conditions, you can also encounter rival characters with additional dialogue. And then we have Akuma. Meet the proper requirements, and Akuma can replace your normal final opponent. Perform well enough against him, and you potentially take things even further by encountering Shin Akuma. So there are more secrets to discover and more reasons to play through arcade mode multiple times. And considering this is a one-man show over here, I primarily play these games by myself. I'll take anything that gives me more single-player content. But there's one addition in particular that I absolutely have to talk about, because after disappearing from the series for years, bonus stages are back. If you've been following this takeover from the beginning, you already know how much bonus stages became part of Street Fighter 2's identity. Smashing the car, breaking the barrel, destroying random stuff between fights for absolutely no reason. They weren't the deepest part of Street Fighter, but they broke up the arcade ladder and became one of those little things people associated with the series. And after Super Street Fighter 2, the concept disappeared. Until now, because Second Impact finally brings back the bonus stage, but Capcom doesn't simply throw another car in front of you and tell you to beat the crap out of it. Instead, they use the bonus stage to teach you Street Fighter 3's defining mechanic, parrying. After your third CPU match, Sean appears and starts throwing basketballs at you. They took something nostalgic from Street Fighter 2 and redesigned it around something completely new from Street Fighter 3. And if you're struggling with parry timing, now you have the safe environment to practice without a fighter beating you down while you're trying to learn. It's a tiny addition, but thematically, I think it perfectly represents what Second Impact is trying to accomplish. And finally, the presentation received another pass. Stages received visual variations and updated color palettes. Music was changed, animations continued to receive new additional polish, and the arcade version even supported a widescreen display option, which was pretty damn unusual for a fighting game in '97. But once again, none of these things individually reinvent Street Fighter 3. But that's the point. Second Impact wasn't trying to. New Generation was the experiments. Second Impact was the refinement. Now, let's talk about the new characters added into this game. We have Akuma, Urien, and Hugo. Let's start with Akuma. And I don't think Akuma needs much of an introduction at this point. We've already talked about him throughout this takeover, but his inclusion here is important because after New Generation only brought back Ryu and Ken, Akuma becomes the third classic Street Fighter character to enter Street Fighter 3. He's hidden rather than part of the standard roster, and depending on how well you perform, you can even encounter the more powerful version of him. His ending is exactly what you'd expect from Akuma. He travels to Ayers Rock in Australia to demonstrate what he calls the Fist of the Master. Akuma unleashes the Kangu Kokoretsuzan, striking the ground with enough force to cause a massive explosion before declaring that the might of the heavens resides within his fists. Next, we have Hugo. And while this is the first playable appearance in Street Fighter, this isn't actually his first Capcom appearance. Hugo is Hugo Andor, based on the enormous Andor enemies from Final Fight. And Hugo has one of the more interesting endings in Second Impact because his partner changes depending on who you defeat as your final opponent. Poison decides Hugo should enter a tag tournament and recruits whoever impressed them during his journey. Depending on your route, that partner can be Ryu, Necro, Elena, or Gil, resulting in teams like the Soul Brothers, Thunderbolt, Beauty and the Beast, or Ragnarok Wonders. It's a fun ending because instead of Hugo's journey being about saving the world or becoming the greatest warrior alive, the entire tournament was basically just an audition for his wrestling partner. And finally, we have Urien, who gives us a much deeper look into the organization behind Gil. Urien is Gil's younger brother, and just like Gil, he's a product of the Secret Society's extensive training and genetic enhancement. His fighting style combines brutal physical attacks with techniques inspired by ancient Greek pancration, while his metallic body and almost statue-like appearance reinforce that Greek and Roman influence. But unlike Gil, Urien isn't interested in quietly fulfilling the same prophecy. He's arrogant, ambitious, and absolutely furious that Gil was chosen above him. That resentment becomes the core of his character. Urien doesn't simply want power. He wants the power he believes should have been his in the first place. And in his ending, he seemingly gets it. Urien is officially recognized as the organization's new president, giving him control under its crisis management forces. But almost immediately, he learns the position isn't exactly the top of the hierarchy. There's still an emperor above him, and that emperor is Gil. So even after finally becoming president, Urien is once again forced to live underneath his brother, setting up a sibling rivalry that is going to become increasingly important as Street Fighter 3 continues. So with all those changes, how did Second Impact actually perform? Well, this is where things get a little complicated because Second Impact's arcade release and eventual home console release tell slightly different stories. In Japan, the arcade actually performed fairly well. Game Machine listed Street Fighter 3 Second Impact as the third most successful arcade game in its December 1st, 97 issue. So clearly, Street Fighter 3 wasn't dead. But by this point, Capcom was still dealing with the problem that followed New Generation. Street Fighter 3 was technically impressive. The animation was incredible. The fighting system was deep. Parrying gave the game an identity completely different from Street Fighter 2. But Street Fighter 3 still wasn't capturing everyone the way its predecessors had. And unfortunately, if you were playing at home in 97, and you couldn't even give Second Impact a chance because just like New Generation, Second Impact never received an individual home console port during its original arcade run. That wouldn't happen until the Dreamcast. In 99, in Japan and 2000 in North America, Capcom finally brought these two versions of Street Fighter 3 home with Street Fighter Double Impact. And like I mentioned earlier, this is exactly how New Generation finally received a home console release as well. Instead of selling the game separately, Capcom put New Generation and Second Impact together on one Dreamcast disc, like I said from earlier. And honestly, it makes a lot of sense because at this point, Second Impact had already improved upon so many things from New Generation that selling the original game by itself probably would have been a difficult proposition. Double Impact gives both an arcade mode, versus mode, training mode options, and while Second Impact also includes parry attack mode, allowing you to play that basketball parrying bonus stage independently. And there was another pretty cool addition. Remember those bosses you weren't normally allowed to play? Well, now you could. Gil became playable in both games while Shin Akuma became playable in Second Impact. So for the first time, players could really sit at home and dig into these first two versions of Street Fighter 3. Now, critically, Double Impact actually did pretty well. It finished with an approximately 79.7% average on game rankings and 84 on Metacritic. GameFan gave it a 90. IGN gave it an 8.8 out of 10. Electronic Gaming Monthly even gave it an 8 out of 10. And GamePro gave it an 80. Game Revolution gave it a 75. GameSpot gave it a 7.2. Those scores, they're not bad at all, but when you actually read the reviews, you can see that critics were still wrestling with the same question players have been asking since New Generation. Where does Street Fighter 3 fit? IGN was extremely positive about the actual fighting system. They scored the gameplay a 9.5 out of 10, describing it as simpler than some of Capcom's other fighters while feeling like a system refined over years of experience. But even IGN couldn't ignore what else Capcom had released, because when they compared Double Impact to Street Fighter Alpha 3, video coming soon, their conclusion was pretty brutal. Alpha 3 wins, and that comparison matters, because Street Fighter 3 wasn't existing in a vacuum. Capcom was effectively competing with itself. You had the Alpha games, you had the Marvel crossovers, and you had all these faster, louder, more independent, recognizable Capcom fighters sitting alongside the game that was technically supposed to be the next number Street Fighter. The game could feel slow compared to something like Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo or Street Fighter Alpha, and parrying could completely change the way matches played. For experienced players still willing to learn, the depth could be incredibly rewarding. For someone who just wanted to pick up Street Fighter and started throwing fireballs, Street Fighter 3 could feel less like it was asking them to relearn the game. And then you had GamePro, which gave Double Impact a 4 out of 5. They praised the sprites, animation, fighting engine, and the ability to practice parrying at home. But they also questioned whether there was really enough separating New Generation from Second Impact to justify having both games in the collection. And that criticism makes sense. When you put these two games right next to each other, Second Impact is clearly the more refined version. New Generation is historically more important because it shows us where Street Fighter 3 started, but Second Impact is essentially Capcom taking that same game and saying, let's fix this. And that seems to be the story surrounding how Double Impact was received around audiences. Critics genuinely agreed that underneath everything was a very good fighting game. Beautiful animations, deep mechanics, parrying was great, and Second Impact had clearly improved upon New Generation. But of course, Street Fighter 3 still had an identity problem, because while Capcom was refining this New Generation, Street Fighter Alpha 3 was sitting right there. It had the familiar characters, it had the huge roster, had tons of modes. It had the faster style many players had already associated with Capcom's fighting games. So even after Second Impact improved Street Fighter 3, the question wasn't necessarily whether the game was good or bad. It was whether players had a reason to choose this Street Fighter over everything else Capcom was offering them. And looking back, there's something almost funny about that. New Generation arrived and didn't quite land. Capcom responded immediately with Second Impact. They expanded the roster, brought Akuma back, but even then, Street Fighter 3 still wasn't finished. Because everything we talked about so far, the new cast, CPS3 hardware, Parry, New Generation, and now Second Impact, was ultimately building toward the version of Street Fighter 3 that would define an entire era. But like I said, this was only the second iteration, which leads me to the final one. So now we arrive at the third and final iteration of Street Fighter 3, Street Fighter 3 Third Strike Fight for the Future. And unlike Second Impact, which arrived only months after New Generation, Capcom spent considerably more time on this one. Development began around the time Second Impact was being completed and continued for roughly a year and a half, with largely the same team returning. In fact, Capcom had already begun conceptualizing the game while Second Impact was still being developed under the provisional name, Second Edition. This wasn't simply another quick update. From the beginning, Third Strike was being positioned as the culmination of everything Capcom had been trying to accomplish with Street Fighter 3. And the developers themselves even admitted why another version was necessary. Second Impact still wasn't the Street Fighter 3 they wanted to make. Funny Mizu described it as being far from ideal, saying it lacked polish and that many ideas had been left out. Neo G echoed that same sentiment, explaining that there were simply things they hadn't been able to accomplish in Second Impact. So for Third Strike, instead of just adding another couple of characters and making balance adjustments, the team went back and re-examined the entire Street Fighter 3 system. Their goal was to refine the fundamentals, improve the graphics and presentation, reconsider mechanics like parrying, and essentially give Street Fighter 3 the complete overhaul they felt it still needed. Funimizu described their intention pretty clearly. They wanted this game to be the final word on the Street Fighter 3 series. At the same time, Capcom understood that Street Fighter 3 couldn't survive entirely on people who had already embraced it. They wanted Third Strike to be somewhat easier for newcomers to approach than Second Impact, which helps explain perhaps its most important returning character, Chun-Li. Her inclusion was partially a response to fan demand, but Funny Mizu also specifically described bringing back a familiar face as a way of attracting people who had never played Second Impact. So Third Strike became this balancing act between new and familiar accessibility and depth, refinement and experimentation. Capcom has spent 2 games trying to figure out exactly what Street Fighter 3 was supposed to be. New Generation created the foundation. Second Impact tried to correct it. But with Third Strike, Capcom wanted to finally get it right, to create the version that represented everything they had been trying to accomplish with Street Fighter 3 from the very beginning. So now that we understand why Third Strike exists, let's actually talk about how the game plays. At its core, this is still Street Fighter 3. If you played New Generation or Second Impact, the basic foundation hasn't suddenly disappeared. You still have the 6-button Street Fighter layout. You still select one of multiple super arts before the fight. EX special moves return, and most importantly, parrying is still the mechanic everything revolves around. By the time we get to Third Strike, Capcom isn't trying to reinvent Street Fighter 3 anymore. Second Impact already established most of the foundation, so instead of going through parrying EX moves, super arts, and all that stuff again, let's focus on what exactly changed. And immediately, the biggest difference is that everything feels like it's been tightened around the game Street Fighter 3 had finally become. The roster expands to 19 fighters. Chun-Li finally returns alongside newcomers Makoto, Q, Remy, and 12, and existing characters receive another round of balancing and adjustments. Capcom described this as essentially a total reconsideration of the Street Fighter 3 system, taking everything they had learned from the first two versions and refining it rather than starting over again. And nowhere is that more obvious than parrying. The mechanic itself obviously returns, but Third Strike cleans up some of the surrounding inputs. Air parries are simplified to use the same forward direction as standard parries, while throws and leap attacks are moved to simultaneously 2-button commands to reduce command overlap. But the major addition was the red parry or guard parry. Now, after you've already started blocking a multi-hit attack, you can release your guard with extremely precise timing and parry the next hit, causing your character to flash red and potentially turn defense into offense. This isn't easy, but that's exactly the point. Capcom had considered introducing another major mechanic comparable to parrying, but ultimately realized there was still more they could do with the system they already had. Third Strike doesn't need another gimmick. Parrying was the gimmick, and now the entire game is being designed around just how far skilled players can push it. Another completely new addition is the judgment system, because apparently beating somebody wasn't enough anymore. Now Capcom wants to judge how you beat their behind. After a match, you're awarded with a grade based on different aspects of your performance, meaning offense, defense, technique, and specific actions can influence your final evaluation. And there's actually interesting reasoning behind this. One of the developers talked about watching highly skilled Second Impact players fight and realizing that simply looking at somebody's win percentage or score couldn't capture what made those matches impressive. So Third Strike attempts to quantify something almost impossible to quantify. How beautifully did you play Street Fighter? It's a small addition mechanically, but philosophically, it tells you exactly where Capcom was headed at. They weren't just designing opponents for you to defeat anymore. They were paying attention to how actual players had learned to express themselves through the systems they created. Single player receives some welcome changes as well. The arcade ladder consists of 10 regular opponents before giving each character a more individualized rival encounter. And in most cases, it's back to Gil because apparently this guy wasn't annoying enough in the first two games. Q also has an interesting role because despite being a normal selectable character, a CPU-controlled Q can suddenly appear as a secret challenger, adding some mystery to repeated arcade runs. And bonus stages are back as well, although there's no reason for me to explain Sean throwing basketballs at us again. You've already seen that in my Second Impact section of the video. But what is new is that Capcom reaches all the way back to Street Fighter 2 and brings back the legendary car-smashing bonus stage. And I think that perfectly represents what Third Strike is doing. The first Street Fighter 3 seemed almost determined to distance itself from Street Fighter's past. Now the new identity and the old identity are finally allowed to exist together. Then there's the presentation, because Third Strike finally establishes an identity that feels complete on its own. If you recall, when it was just New Generation, before Street Fighter was even listed on the name, the game didn't have an identity. Third Strike finally gives it that identity. We already know these games animate beautifully, so I don't need to spend another 5 minutes telling you that. But the smaller details are ridiculous. Clothing and hair constantly moving, mouths animating during victory sequences, incredibly expressive transitions between attacks, and backgrounds. The developers specifically wanted the single player audience to slow down and appreciate it. But the soundtrack, yes, I'm going there. The soundtrack is an arguably even bigger part of the game's personality. Instead of chasing the sound of Street Fighter 2 or Alpha, Third Strike leans into hip hop, rap, house, jazz, and electric music, even bringing in Canadian rapper Infinite for the opening theme. Stage music can also change between rounds, allowing tracks to progress alongside the fight itself. Whether every song works for you or not, you can't mistake this soundtrack for another Street Fighter game. Third Strike knows exactly what it wants to sound like. And that's really the difference between these three versions. New Generation feels like the experiment. Second Impact feels like the correction. But Third Strike feels like Street Fighter 3 fully realized Capcom isn't throwing away everything again. They're taking the systems that survived the first two attempts and building outward from them. The roster finally feels substantial. Chun-Li is back. Parrying gets pushed even further with red parries. The judgment system rewards more than simply winning. Rival battles and secret encounters give the arcade mode more personality. Street Fighter 2's nostalgia is finally allowed back into the room. And the presentation, especially that soundtrack, I'm telling you that soundtrack is good. Maybe y'all tell me another game with a good soundtrack, but this one, they got some heat. This gives the game an identity nobody could confuse with another entry. New Generation was Capcom trying to figure what Street Fighter 3 should be. Second Impact was them correcting the mistakes. Third Strike is the point where they finally seem to understand the game they have been trying to make all along. After 3 attempts, this is the version of Street Fighter 3 that will ultimately define the entire trilogy. Now, before we get into characters, I do want to quickly talk about the different ways Third Strike has been released over the years. Because unlike New Generation, this game actually made its way to quite a few platforms. The original arcade version released in 1999, and even that had 3 different board versions with various bug fixes and gameplay changes. Most notably, changes involving unblockable setups for characters like Irin and Oro. The first home version arrived on the Dreamcast in 2000, bringing arcade versus training and customizable system direction mode along with it. But the Dreamcast version was based on a later arcade revision that removed some of those unlockables. And so it also introduced enough input lag that serious competitive players genuinely preferred the original arcade release. Then when we get to 2004, Third Strike made its way to the PlayStation 2 and the original Xbox. In North America, the PlayStation 2 version was included with the Hyper Street Fighter 2 in the Street Fighter Anniversary Collection, while Japan also received Third Strike as a standalone release. Importantly, the PS2 version was based on an earlier arcade revision, meaning those famous unlockable setups were restored. The Xbox version followed with essentially the same package, but added online play, giving Third Strike one of its earliest official ways to fight people over the internet. Then in 2011, Capcom gave the game probably its most ambitious release with Street Fighter 3 Third Strike Online Edition for the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. Developed by Iron Galaxy, this version added GGPO-based online play, training trials, tournaments, spectator modes, visual filters, achievements, replay sharing, and an optional remix soundtrack. So this wasn't simply Capcom throwing an arcade ROM into another console. They actually tried to modernize the experience. And finally, if you're looking for one of the easiest official ways to play Third Strike today, the arcade version was included in the 30th Anniversary Collection in 2018 for the PlayStation 4, Xbox One, Nintendo Switch, and PC. Third Strike is one of the 4 games in that collection with online functionality. So unlike the first 2 versions of Street Fighter 3, which became considerably more obscure over time, Third Strike has repeatedly been brought forward to newer hardware. And I think that alone tells you something about what eventually happened to this game, because the version of Street Fighter 3 that Capcom originally created as its final attempt to get the formula right would eventually become the version people kept wanting to play again and again. Now, let's talk about the characters. First and foremost, all the characters return with new additions, like I said earlier. Chun-Li made a return. Then we have Makoto, Q, Remy, and 12, who make their debut in this game. Now understand, chronologically, Third Strike takes place nearly 1 year after the events of New Generation and Second Impact. So we'll look at these characters once again and see where everyone is at now. Starting with Alex, since he was the leading man for the game originally. Ryu and Ken were still around, but Alex was positioned as the face of this new generation. And by the time we reach Third Strike, his motivation has changed quite a bit from the first time we met him. Originally, Alex's journey was personal. Gil defeated his mentor and father figure Tom, which sent Alex out looking for revenge. But after everything he experienced, fighting has become something more than settling a score. Alex has developed a genuine hunger for competition. According to his Third Strike profile, he hears that the world's strongest fighters are gathering and leaves Tom behind once again because he simply can't suppress that excitement anymore. And his ending really drives that home. Alex encounters Ryu and gets absolutely humbled by him. Alex admits that he couldn't even counter one of Ryu's attacks and realizes that Ryu's reputation doesn't do him justice. He's even stronger than Alex imagined. But instead of discouraging him, this completely changes Alex's direction. He becomes obsessed with the idea of fighting Ryu again. He writes back home apologizing to Tom and Pat because he's going to be gone for a while. He basically tells them, I know this sounds crazy, but I can't control myself. I have to see him again. I have to fight him. And I like this progression for Alex because Third Strike isn't really about revenge anymore. Gil may have been the reason Alex encountered this world, but Ryu becomes the reason he wants to remain in it. Back home, Tom understands exactly what's happening. Alex has discovered the same thing that has driven characters like Ryu throughout this entire series, the desire to find stronger opponents and discover just how strong you can become. So while Alex may not have ultimately replaced Ryu as the face of Street Fighter like Capcom originally intended, his Third Strike ending almost feels like the moment he begins following the same endless path as him. Then we have Remy, one of the completely new characters introduced in Third Strike. And Remy is interesting because unlike a lot of Street Fighter characters who fights because they love competition, Remy practically hates everything the fighting world represents. His profile describes him as being trapped somewhere between love and hate, consumed by resentment towards someone he simply cannot forgive. That person is his father. Remy's father was a fighter who abandoned his family to pursue the life of a warrior. Remy blames that obsession for destroying his family, leaving both him and his sister behind. And that makes Remy almost the complete opposite of somebody like Ryu. Ryu sees the endless pursuit of strength as his purpose in life. Remy sees what happens to the people left behind when somebody makes that pursuit their entire life. His ending has him returning to the Bay of Biscay, where his sister's body has been preserved beneath the water. And this is where Remy finally confronts the hatred he's been carrying. He admits that he still can't forgive his father, but realizes that continuing to live consumed by that anger isn't going to change anything. So Remy says goodbye to his sister, decides to leave that darkness behind, and walks towards the light, hoping that maybe doing so will finally lead him towards happiness. And now we have Ryu. And at this point, you already know what Ryu is about. There isn't some giant revenge plot or tournament prize motivating him. He's still wandering the world, trying to answer the same question that has defined his life. What does it mean to be a true warrior. And his third strike ending actually has Ryu questioning whether that journey can ever have an ending. Why does he need to become stronger? What exists beyond victory? He realizes he essentially has two choices: stop asking these questions entirely, or continue fighting until he finally finds answers. And come on, this is Ryu we're talking about. As long as there are stronger opponents out there, Ryu knows he's not finished. He watches a leaf fall into his hand and admits that he isn't even close to understanding where that leaf will fall next. So he makes his decision: as long as he has the strength to move one finger, he'll keep fighting. There may never be an actual final destination for Ryu because the journey itself is what defines him. Then we have Ken, who is in a very different place in life compared to his best friend. Ken isn't wandering around searching for some philosophical answer. He's a family man, he's successful, and he's one of the strongest fighters in America. But after going a long time without facing a truly worthy opponent, hearing about powerful fighters gathering and supporting his student Sean is enough to reignite that competitive fire. And Ken's ending is probably one of the more light-hearted ones because we get to see just how ridiculously successful this man has become. Ken wins the U.S. Martial Arts Championship for the third consecutive time, apparently defeating his final opponent in about 30 seconds. His family and friends celebrate with him, and Ken even brings the championship trophy over to Sean. Sean initially thinks Ken is giving him the trophy, but Ken basically tells him no. If Sean wants one, he's going to have to earn it himself. Ken reminds him that he didn't even make it through the qualifying rounds and jokes that Sean isn't becoming champion anytime soon if he still can't beat his master. And I like that because Ryu and Ken have reached two completely different places while still remaining recognizable as the characters we've always known. Ryu is a solitary warrior who will probably search for strength forever. Ken has built an entire life around himself: family, friends, championships, and now a student. But the competitive fire hasn't disappeared. They're still walking the same martial arts path. They're just walking it in completely different directions. And now we get to probably the biggest returning character in Third Strike, Chun-Li. After being absent from New Generation and Second Impact, Chun-Li finally returns to Street Fighter 3, but she's no longer chasing, please forgive me if I say this wrong, Shadulo, or trying to avenge her father. In fact, Chun-Li has basically left the fighting world behind and started teaching Kung Fu to children. That changes when one of the children under her care is kidnapped. Chun-Li returns to action, tracks the girl down, rescues her, and 6 months later realizes something important. Holding that child in her arms made Chun-Li understand what her true fight should actually be. After everything she's experienced, her purpose isn't revenge anymore. Chun-Li dedicates herself to teaching the next generation. She wants these children to understand true strength and beauty, and she sees them as part of the future her father once fought to protect. So Third Strike gives Chun-Li something she really hasn't been allowed to have before: closure and life beyond in Bison. She's still the strongest woman in the world when she needs to be, but now she's fighting to create a future rather than avenge a past. Then we have Sean. And unfortunately for Sean, his journey to becoming the next Ken Masters still has a long way to go. Sean is finally ready to enter a legitimate fighting championship, but Ken is very clear with him. At his current level, he's going to embarrass himself. Sean needs more training, and more importantly, he needs to stop simply trying to imitate Ken and develop a fighting style that's actually his own. But Sean enters anyway, and his ending initially makes it look like the kid finally did it. He wins his first tournament, declares himself the US champion, and starts celebrating because he believes he finally reached the same level as his master. And then Sean wakes up. The entire championship victory was a dream. In reality, Sean didn't even make it past the qualifying rounds. Ken tells him he nearly passed, but nearly doesn't count and sends him straight back to training. Sean takes it surprisingly well and promises that next time he'll come back and win for real. So Sean's story remains exactly what it's always been. Potential without refinement. He wants desperately to reach Ken's level, but Third Strike reminds us that he's nowhere near that yet. Then we have Ibuki, whose greatest enemy continues to be something far more terrifying than Gil or the Illuminati, having to live the life of a ninja. Graduation is approaching, and after spending basically her entire childhood training in her ninja village, Ibuki wants what she's always wanted, a normal life. She wants to attend an ordinary university, meet people, have fun, and experience everything she feels like she's been missing. The problem is that before she's allowed to do that, she has to complete her village's strict graduation requirements. And amazingly, she actually makes it. Ibuki gets accepted into her university, and for a moment it looks like she's finally escaped. She's walking around campus, meeting new people, and gets invited to join a club by a guy she thinks is cute. Ibuki throws herself into a university life, thinking that after years of ninja training, she can finally be an ordinary girl. Except there's one problem. It's a ninjutsu club. So instead of escaping the ninja life, Ibuki accidentally signs herself up for even more of it. Her ending shows her going through the brutal endurance exercises, underwater training, riding a kite through a storm, and getting put through the ringer by her upperclassmen. She finally realizes that her supposedly normal university life has basically turned into ninja training college edition. And I like this in Third Strike. It doesn't reinvent Ibuki. Her story is still this funny contradiction between being an incredibly talented ninja. She finally gets the normal college life experience she wanted. She just accidentally picked the least normal club imaginable. Next, we have Yun, and the twins are once again protecting Hong Kong, but this time they're dealing directly with the secret society. Yun discovers that a mysterious organization has been operating behind the scenes and threatening the city. That eventually brings him face to face with Gil, who doesn't necessarily treat Yun like an enemy. Instead, Gil respects his abilities and actually offers Yun and his people a place with the ideal society he intends to create. But Yun isn't buying any of it. As far as he's concerned, Gil's perfect society is completely worthless if people don't have a choice on how they live. Gil explains his philosophy, balancing opposing forces and creating a new world through coexistence. But Yun still refuses him. And after leaving, Yun admits to Yang that Gil's words are still bothering him. He doesn't completely understand what Gil is planning, but he knows it's enough to recognize that something isn't right. Yang basically tells him to stop worrying. They're leaders of their own town, and whatever Gil is planning, they'll protect their people themselves. Yun agrees, refusing to allow some self-proclaimed supreme being to decide their future. They'll make their own dreams come true. And naturally, wherever Yun goes, Yang isn't too far behind. Yang's motivation is essentially the same, protect their home from the organization threatening it. But whereas Yun is the more impulsive of the brothers, Yang is generally the calmer one. Even if he doesn't agree with how Yun handles things, he's going to support his brother when their community is in danger. After everything is over, Yang's ending gets much more personal. The twins return home and immediately get yelled at by Hoi Mei, who has been worried sick for a while since they've been gone. She tells him that the town could have been destroyed, and neither of them seems to understand how reckless they have been. And now we get to our next newcomer, Makoto, the self-proclaimed super hard karate girl. Makoto is the only daughter of the prestigious Rindokan Karate Dojo. After the death of her father, the dojo's reputation declined and eventually fell on hard times. Makoto isn't willing to watch her family's legacy disappear, so she enters the fighting world with one very simple goal: make the dojo famous again. And she does that in probably the most Makoto way possible, by beating the hell out of everyone. After defeating some of the world's strongest fighters, the word spreads about the incredibly powerful young master of the Rikodan. Fighters begin traveling from everywhere just for the opportunity to train in the dojo. to the point where they're literally standing in line outside waiting for their chance. The dojo is suddenly more popular than it's been in years, and Makoto has accomplished exactly what she set out to do. Her family is proud of her. The Rikodan name has been restored, and its future appears secure. But Makoto isn't satisfied. Instead of staying home and enjoying her success, she tells her grandfather that she's leaving on another journey because she still hasn't had enough. Her dojo may finally be back on the map, but Makoto herself is just getting started. Next, we have Necro, and unfortunately, escaping the Illuminati didn't exactly mean that he had Effie with him and they were finally free. The organization is still hunting them because Necro himself is essentially living evidence of their experiments. So Necro and Effie have spent their lives constantly running, and in his ending, they've been pushed to the absolute limit. They're abroad with a moving train trying to reach the border when the organization finally catches up with them. Agents surround the train, and Necro realizes that they're about to be cornered. Effie refuses to give up, and the two try to fight their way through. But during the escape, Effie is knocked from the train. Necro immediately jumps in after her, grabbing her as they fall together towards the water below. And somehow, they survive. Necro wakes up holding Effie and calls it a miracle. And for someone who has spent much of his life viewing his mutated body as a curse, he finally looks at it differently. Holding Effie, Necro says that for the first time, he's thankful for the body he has. They may still be fugitives, and their freedom still isn't guaranteed. But hey, they're alive, they're together, and Necro finally has something worth embracing about the person he's become. Then we have Oro, who apparently decided retirement was getting a little too boring. Oro has spent decades isolated from the world, but rumors of powerful fighters and the mysterious organization convince him to start paying attention again. And after encountering Ryu, Oro becomes particularly interested. Fighting Ryu apparently gets his blood pumping in a way that it hasn't in a very long time. In fact, Oro says it's been 50 years since he's trained this seriously, and instead of simply looking at Ryu as another opponent, Oro starts looking at him as a potential successor. He recognizes something special in him and decides that Ryu may be the person worth passing his knowledge to. There's just one problem. Ryu isn't ready yet. Oro believes Ryu needs to continue training, estimating that it will take at least another 15 years before he's developed enough. And Oro even jokes that hopefully Ryu becomes so powerful that he'll eventually have to fight him using both arms. So Oro's story isn't really about defeating Gil or stopping the secret society. He's found something much more interesting to him, the possibility of what Ryu could eventually become. And then we have Elena, whose story is probably one of the most wholesome in the entire game. Remember, Elena's profile is actually one of the things that helps establish our new timeline. Nearly a year has passed since she said goodbye to the friends she made while studying in Japan. Now she's studying abroad in France, but rather than chasing down some evil organization or searching for the world's strongest fighter, Elena has a much simpler goal. She just wants to make new friends. Her ending takes the form of a letter to her Japanese friend Naru. Sitting in a cafe in France after the Harvest Festival, Elena admits that she's beginning to feel lonely. She remembers the summer they spent together in Japan, the festivals, the fireworks, and even the fights they experienced along the way. But instead of allowing that loneliness to consume her, Elena starts thinking about the future. She invites Naru and her family to come visit her and meet her own family, hoping that maybe they can reunite during the winter holiday. And then Elena simply goes back to studying because, unlike half the people on this roster, she actually has schoolwork to do. And I like this because Elena's story doesn't really need some massive conflict. In a game filled with secret societies, genetically modified fighters, ancient martial artists, and people searching for ultimate strength, Elena is just traveling the world, experiencing different cultures and making connections with people. For Elena, the journey isn't about becoming the strongest. It's about the people she meets along the way. Next, we have Dudley, and compared to the secret organizations, experiments, and world-ending conspiracies going on around him, Dudley is still trying to be the classiest fighter on the planet. By this point, Dudley has regained his championship title and has even been awarded the special title of Sir, but becoming a champion hasn't killed his desire to fight. If anything, Dudley is now searching for an even greater challenge, something worthy of his skills and his reputation. His ending barely has anything to do with fighting. We find Dudley peacefully tending to the rose garden his father left him, admiring different varieties of roses and talking about how their beauty still has his heart. His butler then reminds him that he has a very important royal match scheduled for 8 p.m., and Dudley suddenly realizes he only has 5 hours left. So they immediately take off towards the mansion, leaving this gigantic rose garden behind. That's basically Dudley in a nutshell. He's a world-class boxer. He's apparently fighting matches important enough to involve royalty, but he'll still lose track of time because he's busy smelling the roses. Then we get to one of the strangest characters introduced in Street Fighter 3, Q. And unlike mostly everybody else we talked about, Q doesn't really have a traditional story. In fact, we don't even know who or what Q actually is. His ending doesn't follow Q itself. Instead, we see what appears to be an intelligence agency investigating a series of bizarre incidents occurring around the world. They've recorded 13 strange cases with only 10 days, and when examining photographs from these completely unrelated locations, investigators notice something. There's a man in a trench coat appearing in the background of every single one of them. The incidents happen in different parts of the world, making it seemingly impossible for the same person to have been present at all of them. But the figure always has the same clothing and appearance. Eventually, a photo analysis gives them their first real look at him. an iron mask with glowing yellow eyes. The agency immediately orders an investigation, sending the image to its branches with an extremely high security clearance. And that's it. We don't learn Q's identity. We don't learn why he's traveling around the world. We don't know whether he's chasing these incidents, investigating them himself, or simply just witnessing them. We don't even know if Q is human. And that's exactly what makes this an interesting character. Everybody else gets an ending that gives us some kind of resolution. Q's ending does the complete opposite. It gives us more questions than answers. Then we have Urine, who probably spent the last year becoming even more pissed off at his brother. Urine has managed to defeat the opposition within the secret society and become its new president. Normally, that would be the end of his ambition. He finally has a position of power he's been fighting for. Except Gil still outranks him. Gil remains the organization's emperor, and Urine absolutely cannot tolerate the idea that after everything he's accomplished, he's still standing in his brother's shadow. So Urine decides he's done playing by the organization's rules. He enters one of the secret society's facilities containing the accumulated knowledge or brains the organization has collected for 2,000 years. And sitting among them is a preservation chamber belonging to Gil. Urine looks at everything the organization has built, basically calls centuries of accumulated knowledge useless garbage, and then activates the facility's self-destruct sequence. The entire structure explodes behind him, and Urine doesn't even turn around. He declares that there is no longer a mission or legacy for him to succeed. From this point forward, he's going to create his own story. And the ending closes with one of the most ridiculous lines in the entire game. I hereby define this year the first year of AU after Urine. So while Gil wants to reshape humanity according to the secret society's vision, Urine wants something much more personal. He wants a world defined by Urine. Next is 12, and this is where we get another look at just how far the secret society's experiments have gone. 12 is described as the organization's ultimate humanoid weapon, an improved model based on the experiments that created Necro. Unlike Necro, 12's entire body can transform, allowing him to reshape himself into different forms as he relentlessly hunts whatever target he's been assigned. But his ending reveals something even bigger happening behind the scenes. Back at one of the organization's labs, Dr. Cure returns to find that the subjects 12 and 14 have already been withdrawn and the procedure has been completed. The scientists reveal what they've accomplished. They managed to restore every cell of the human body to its condition before battle. And apparently, this technology comes from Uran's theory of human body reconstruction. The scientists immediately understand the implications. If this process can continue developing, mankind could eventually reach to the point where people never grow old and never die. They've essentially created the foundation for immortality. Their only remaining problem is reducing the subject's memory damage to below 0.001%. And this leads to a disturbing part. One scientist celebrates the creation of a never dying warrior, imagining someone who can continuously die and be reborn without the pain or consequences of death. But another scientist points out one major problem. 12 can't dream because his memory is constantly active. He apparently doesn't possess the ability to enter the kind of mental state required for dreams. And suddenly, immortality doesn't sound quite as amazing as they thought. 12 may represent the secret society's idea of the perfect biological weapon, something that can transform, regenerate, and potentially live forever. But the ending leaves you wondering whether they've created an immortal human being or just another immortal machine made out of flesh. Then we have Hugo, and his story is considerably less complicated. After his performance in the previous tournament, Hugo has earned a widespread respect as a fighter, but there's one problem. Nobody is strong enough anymore. So Hugo and his manager Poison decide that instead of waiting around for worthy opponents, they're going to create something new. His ending begins after Hugo wins what appears to be a World Tag Team Championship. But before he can even celebrate, the entire arena starts shaking. At first, everybody thinks it's an earthquake. Nope, it's Hugo. He's literally lifting part of the arena. And that's when a group calling themselves the HWA, the Huge Wrestling Army, shows up with an offer. They've already recruited more than 50 fighters, and according to them, every challenger has eventually joined their ranks after being forced to defeat Hugo first. And then we see somebody else they've apparently dragged into this insanity. Ryu. Ryu looks completely confused about why he's even there, while Ken seems to be having the time of his life watching the whole thing unfold. Eventually, Hugo accepts, and just like that, the wrestling ring becomes the HWA's new base of operations. It's probably one of the funniest endings in the game because Hugo isn't trying to control the world, uncover some conspiracy, or achieve enlightenment. He just wants stronger people to fight. So naturally, the solution is to create an entire army of professional wrestlers. And finally, we have Akuma. Akuma's story is exactly what you'd expect from him. He's mastered his fist, continues walking the path of pure combat and is still searching for opponents powerful enough to withstand him. But instead of simply telling us how powerful Akuma has become, his ending decides to show us in the most ridiculous way possible. We begin at 1,500 meters beneath the ocean, where a deep sea research team is descending towards its observation point. Everything appears normal until they establish visual contact with something outside. At first, the crew can't even understand what they're looking at because standing on the wreckage of a sunken ship is a man. At the bottom of the ocean, it's Akuma. Before anyone can even process just how that's possible, communication with the research team is suddenly lost. Another ship on the surface tries desperately to contact them, and then the ocean erupts. Akuma launches an attack from beneath the water, destroying the wreckage around him. And that's the ending. There isn't some massive character revelation here. There doesn't need to be. Akuma has reached to the point where this game is essentially asking, what can this man punch next? Mountains aren't enough, fighters aren't enough, and apparently now, Akuma is training at the bottom of the ocean. And somehow, knowing Akuma, that feels completely normal. When Street Fighter 3 Third Strike arrived, the reception was noticeably stronger than what the series had received with New Generation and Second Impact. Critics were beginning to see the vision Capcom had been chasing since '97 finally coming together. The Dreamcast release earned an 81 on game rankings, while the Famitsu gave it a 34 out of 40. IGN scored it at 8.3 out of 10, and GamePro gave it an 18 out of 20. In Japan, it also performed well in the arcades, with Game Machine listing Third Strike as the most successful arcade game in the month of July '99, eventually becoming Japan's ninth highest grossing arcade software kit of '99. So while this wasn't the massive mainstream phenomenon that Street Fighter 2 had been, Street Fighter 3 was finally beginning to find its audience. Another major reason was that critics really felt Third Strike was the most complete version of Street Fighter 3. The fundamentals established by the first two games were still here, but Capcom had continued refining them. The expanded 19-character roster received attention, particularly the return of Chun-Li alongside the newcomers. Reviewers also praised improvements such as more accurate hit detection, the new grading system, additional attacks, better character balancing, and the ability to select your next opponent. One contemporary review described it as having some of the best 2D animation available, while calling Third Strike the definitive version of the Street Fighter 3 series. More importantly, by this third iteration, the parry system and the technical nature of Street Fighter 3 weren't simply strange new mechanics anymore. They become part of the game's identity. But that doesn't mean everyone believed Capcom had completely solved the problems surrounding Street Fighter 3. IGN's Jeremy Dunham thought the game was engaging and worthy of owning, but the question of how necessary it was for players who had already purchased Double Impact only months earlier. He also believed the Dreamcast version looked more pixelated and less colorful than Double Impact, while its slower pace could make it less appealing to players coming from faster games like Marvel vs. Capcom 2 or Capcom vs. SNK. Next Generation expressed a similar sense of fatigue, giving it 3 out of 5 stars and essentially arguing that while it was deep, complex, and fun, players who had already experienced the previous Street Fighter 3 games might simply be burnt out. That was really the problem Capcom couldn't escape. Third Strike might have been the best version of Street Fighter 3, but it was also the third version of Street Fighter 3 in roughly 2 years. And that's what makes the reception of Third Strike so interesting when looking back at it today. At release, it was generally considered a very good fighting game aimed primarily at dedicated fighting game fans rather than some revolutionary mainstream comeback for Street Fighter. It was moderately profitable, but initially wasn't particularly popular. Its reputation would instead grow after its original release, and players spent years discovering just how deep its combat system actually was. What began as the third revision of a Street Fighter sequel that had struggled to replace Street Fighter 2 would eventually become the entry many people consider the masterpiece of the trilogy. Now that we've uncovered the history behind Street Fighter 3, I think it's safe to say that the third time is really the charm. And I feel like I'm preaching to the choir when I say that Third Strike is probably the best iteration of Street Fighter 3. Before I even started this series, this was the game I knew had a reputation. And trust me, throughout this takeover, my comment section made damn sure I knew what was waiting for me. Everybody talked about Third Strike like this was the one. So finally getting here, playing through all three versions, and actually watching Street Fighter evolve for myself made me appreciate the game considerably more because I started noticing a pattern throughout this takeover. The first version of a numbered Street Fighter isn't necessarily the best version of the game. We saw it with Street Fighter 2, and now we watched it happen again with Street Fighter 3. New Generation established the foundation, but there were clearly things Capcom hadn't figured out yet. Then Second Impact came along and started correcting those problems. And finally, Third Strike feels like everything clicked. Today, most of these changes would have probably been patches or downloadable updates. Back then, you bought a whole new game. Thankfully, Street Fighter 3 only needed 2 major updates to get here, which is definitely better than what happened with Street Fighter 2. And if somebody new to Street Fighter asked me where they should start, I genuinely think Third Strike and the Alpha games would be near the top of my list. There's definitely a learning curve here, especially when you start to understand parrying, but there's something about the game that immediately grabs you. The moment you boot it up, you hear that music, you know this isn't trying to sound like Street Fighter 2. You get that character select screen and might waste time just sitting there listening to infinite rap because it gives the entire game an atmosphere. The animation, music, stages, characters, everything finally feels like it belongs to the same identity. And that's probably the biggest takeaway from this entire game. Remember how Street Fighter 3 started? New Generation wasn't even originally supposed to be Street Fighter. It was struggling to project searching for an identity before Ryu was added and it became a sequel to one of the biggest fighting games ever made. Then Capcom took an enormous risk, staying with 2D while the industry was obsessed with 3D, then removing almost every marquee character associated with Street Fighter, and even introducing an almost entirely new generation and building the game around mechanics that players had to completely relearn. Some of those decisions worked, some absolutely did not, and the timing of everything worked against them. But that's why I think Third Strike is such a perfect ending to this story. A game that originally struggled to find an identity eventually created one of the strongest identities in the entire franchise. Capcom didn't completely abandon what failed with New Generation. They kept working on it. They refined the gameplay, expanded the roster, brought some of the old Street Fighters back without sacrificing the new, and eventually turned this weird experimental sequel into something people are still playing and talking about decades later. So, was Street Fighter 3 a victim of its time? Absolutely. But Third Strike proved that sometimes being a product of your time doesn't mean you have to stay trapped there. It took 3 games, years of development, plenty of risk, and a whole lot of trial and error to get here. But in the end, the third time is the charm. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you so much for watching. I know this episode was quite a bit lengthy, but I hope you enjoyed it. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to leave a like. It really helps smaller channels like mine grow and tells YouTube that this content is worth sharing with other retro gaming fans. And next week, we're tapping into the next crossover game with Marvel Heroes versus Street Fighter. If you want to be there when that video drops, make sure to hit the subscribe button to the channel and ring the notification bell so you don't miss it. And if you're feeling a little extra generous, you can always buy me a cup of coffee. Link is in the description. With that said, this is the Retro Phantom, signing out.